Hi everyone, I'm here for a further discussion of trends in robotics. Now, it's very interesting to see how everyone is seeing the world and the changes going on in the world, especially with how robots are becoming much more efficient and the combination of artificial intelligence and robots and different ways of improving the mechanism of the robot is becoming very interesting. I think the ideal would be for the robots to have a much more independent way of working. Now, I think people have touched on this in the past where that's the trend with UAVs, the trends with submarines, the trends with a lot of other things. And in terms of the workplace, it's going to be the trend too. For example, a lot of the warehouses in Amazon have robots scurrying about helping to fulfill orders. Now, this can be scary because people might say, well, what's going to happen with the jobs of other people? Well, people will do other things, and that's happened for the last 150 years. And in fact, we've had this renaissance for the last 400 years. And so this is an ongoing idea of constant improvement. And remember, this is more a modern trend. So during the Middle Ages in Europe, there was not really innovation. People were happy just for things to stay the way they were. So when you look at it, if that was the way things were for 1,000 years in Europe, do we really want that to be that way? Don't we want change? And robots and robotics is another means of helping to improve the life, because ultimately life is about the improved efficiency in society. And that's what allows people to live a better lifestyle. That's why people aren't going and washing their clothes separately. You have a washing machine. That's why people aren't growing their own food on their farm, because they have other people who prefer to do that. So a specialization. But I think what will happen now is this specialization that's out there will change in a little way because the robots and robotics will help alleviate that need for specialization, because that's what the robots will be doing. So people will be more of the generalists overseeing things, understanding how things are done. So it's a very good question though. Where does it lead? As when robotics improves the life of society and improves the life of the worker, what happens with the worker? And that's a question that really has no answer, because it's going to constantly be evolving. And as I mentioned, don't forget, there was the farmer 150 years ago that feared for his job. And those people who feared for their jobs, they were called the Luddites. They thought machines were not any good. But we've seen that machines did help. And robots are just extensions of machines. And it's just figuring out, what will that trend be for the usage of the machines? And how will that impact the average person? That's a very interesting question, and a question that is trying to be answered. And this is where people are trying to understand, what rights do people have? What rights do the machines have? Robotics. Should they be treated separately? And then as computing power increases and as the programs for robotics increases, it's going to pose some very interesting questions. Now, a lot of the memory becomes a big issue. As memory and memory storage changes, like what happens then? What happens when the robots start to have much more memory than any individual person? What happens when the memory becomes more crystalline? Or, as has been theorized, they start, instead of using silicon chips, they use molecules to store the information, which would be phenomenal. So when you have a robot, you would be able to store a huge amount of information within the robot. And so would that be on the cusp of biology, where you start storing information and retained information in a molecular sense? And so where would the limits be, and what would the limits of society be? I mean, many science fiction films have touched on this, and we as a society are only bringing this up now to see where the limits are, sort of like to think through what the problems are going to be in the future, and there will be problems, but possibly now there might be 10 years, well, possibly the problems won't be right now, but like 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now. But as I mentioned in some earlier videos, the dream of robotics and the theory of what you need to do with robots and the boundary between man and robot has been around for many, many years. Here, though, the possibilities are increasing. I think that the minute they start making these robots more accessible, it will prove to be a very big boon to humanity.